The Gestapo, Nazi Germany's secret police, is a name that has become synonymous with brutality and torture. Officially known as the Geheime Staatspolizei, established in 1933, quickly became known for its brutal methods of silencing opponents and implementing the Nazi goal of a totalitarian regime with an obedient population. During wartime, the Gestapo captured enemy men and women. Their interrogation methods exemplify some of the most inhumane practices in modern history. The captured women actually suffered more than the men. In addition to physical torture, women were subjected to psychological torture, which exacerbated their suffering. What weapons and techniques were used on the captured women? What kind of torture did they endure at the hands of the Gestapo personnel? And what stories of bravery emerged from those who suffered this torture? Unbearable physical pain, the Gestapo's brutal torture tactics. The physiological effects of Gestapo torture have been extensively documented in post-war medical reports, as well as in forensic examinations performed on survivors and recovered bodies. Repeated dislocations of shoulders, hips, and wrists caused permanent damage to ligaments and cartilage, resulting in partial paralysis, muscle necrosis, or loss of joint mobility. In many cases, victims developed compressive neuropathies, a condition caused by prolonged pressure on the nerves, leading to chronic pain, muscle spasms, and loss of sensation in the extremities. Burns from hot metal objects or cigarettes not only left visible scars, but also caused systemic infections due to the lack of subsequent medical treatment. Prolonged exposure to electric shocks, especially in sensitive areas such as the genitals or fingers, caused what medical reports call severe nervous depolarization, characterized by convulsions, cardiac arrhythmias, and, in some cases, temporary respiratory paralysis. According to files recovered from military hospitals in 1946, several women released from Gestapo prisons in Prague, Vienna, and Berlin presented with multiple bone trauma, deep skin infections, and tooth loss consistent with forced extractions without anesthesia. In organizational terms, the Gestapo had semi-standardized interrogation protocols, which were applied in its regional offices. Although there was no official published manual, several documents seized by Allied forces after the war refer to Sonderverhörmethoden, special interrogation methods. These were used with local authorization in cases classified as extremely dangerous or repeat enemies of the state. The procedure consisted of a gradual sequence: verbal interrogation, mild physical intimidation, sensory deprivation, and finally, intensified physical techniques. Everything had to be recorded in a protocol book, although in many cases the methods used were not documented, only the results. Those responsible for using these techniques were agents with prior experience in political repression or members transferred from concentration camps. In several offices, especially in Vienna, Krakow, and Stuttgart, black rooms or armored basements, specially designed to apply physical torture without leaving any audible or visible traces in the upper facilities, were set up. These rooms were equipped with fixed shackles, fluid drains, and restraint mechanisms. The use of doctors to monitor victims' physical endurance was occasional, but according to War Crimes Commission files, it was recorded in at least 15 offices. Their role was to assess whether the victim could continue to endure the procedure without dying prematurely, as the priority was to obtain information before the body collapsed. This clinical pain control increased the effectiveness of prolonged interrogations. Women who fell into the hands of the cruel Gestapo were usually bound by their wrists and ankles, either strapped or held to the corners of a table. Sometimes they were forced to lie on their backs with their arms and legs fully extended. The torture table was equipped with a device that allowed interrogators to gradually tighten the restraints. Each rotation increased the tension on the victim's limbs, causing severe pain by forcing their bodies to extend beyond their natural limits. The victims experienced terrible pain as they were stretched. Muscles and tendons began to tear and joints dislocated, usually starting at the shoulders and progressing to the hips. Some victims suffered bone fractures that could leave them permanently disabled. Electric shock torture involved the placement of electrodes on highly sensitive regions of the body, such as the fingers, feet, or genitals. Once connected, the interrogators delivered brief but powerful electric shocks, causing intense, instant pain, involuntary muscle contractions, and even burns or nerve damage. The victims had no control over their muscles during the shocks, causing great discomfort and terror, especially because the shocks were often applied randomly. Among the most painful forms of torture were nail and tooth extraction. During these procedures, interrogators would pull fingernails and toenails from their nail beds with tweezers or similar tools, exposing the sensitive nerve endings in these areas and causing intense suffering. Because of the open wounds and unhygienic environment, infections were common, causing prolonged pain and, in many cases, permanent damage. Tooth extraction without anesthesia involved removing teeth while the victim remained conscious, which caused excruciating pain. In addition to causing physical suffering, this technique had a profound emotional impact as women feared further extractions. In the technique known as suspension by the pole, or strappado, a prisoner was hung by their wrists after having them tied behind their back. This forced the arms upward, placing extreme strain on the chest and shoulders. Their own weight pulled on their shoulders as they hung, frequently causing dislocated joints, torn muscles, and even nerve damage. Victims often suffered permanent injuries or disabilities as a result of the pain and excruciating posture they endured for hours. In burning torture, prisoners might be placed near open flames or burned with cigarettes. The Gestapo sometimes applied hot metal objects to the skin, causing severe burns that were difficult to treat and took a long time to heal. Another technique was scalding, which involved applying hot metal objects to the skin or pouring hot water over certain areas of the body, causing severe burns. In addition to the intense and immediate pain, this created long-lasting wounds that frequently became infected. The Gestapo regularly beat and whipped prisoners severely. Prisoners were often stripped naked to increase their suffering and vulnerability before being repeatedly beaten with heavy whips, metal rods, or rubber truncheons. These beatings caused deep tissue damage, severe bruising and bleeding, and continued until the skin was broken. The intensity and frequency of the beatings often caused permanent injury or, in the worst cases, death due to internal bleeding or damage. Falaka or bastinado, a particularly painful form of flogging, was applied to the soles of the feet. Prisoners were repeatedly beaten on their feet while they were bound. Due to the large number of sensitive nerve endings in the feet, the extreme pain of this technique was especially unbearable. Not surprisingly, many women could not endure such intense brutality and emotional suffering. The humiliation, physical pain, and moral despair drove them to the limit, causing some to lose their sanity. Beyond the visible physical damage, the Gestapo also developed methods aimed at breaking the minds of its prisoners. Once the physical limits were reached or surpassed, a new phase began: thought manipulation, isolation, and systematic emotional exhaustion. Psychological torture became an essential component of the repressive apparatus, designed to destroy all internal resistance without the need to raise a hand. At the next level of torment, the enemy was no longer physical pain, but silence, fear, and calculated loneliness. Breaking the mind, the Gestapo's psychological torture of captured women. The Nazi repressive apparatus did not act haphazardly in its application of psychological torture. There was a theoretical and administrative framework that legitimized these practices as tools for the re-education of the enemy or their moral destruction. Beginning in 1935, the Reich Ministry of the Interior authorized the use of prolonged destabilization methods in interrogations of enemies of the state based on supposed behavioral psychology studies. These studies were adapted and manipulated by psychiatrists aligned with the regime, such as Max de Krinis and Karl Schneider, who promoted the use of sensory deprivation, sleep deprivation, and solitary confinement as mechanisms to erode individual will. The Gestapo incorporated these ideas into unofficial internal manuals, many of which were recovered after the war. One of them, known as the Anweisung, left psychic Zersetzung, instruction for psychic decomposition, recommended tactics such as prolonged isolation without stimulation, the imposition of chaotic routines, constant misinformation, and the use of fake friendly interrogators. These techniques focused not on obtaining immediate confessions, but on provoking an emotional breakdown that would drive victims to cooperate out of desperation. One of the most used strategies was the Einzelhaft with suggestion, or individual confinement with suggestion, consisted of keeping the prisoner completely isolated for days or weeks, interrupted by brief interrogation sessions where she was offered false information, that her relatives had died, that her husband had betrayed her, or that her cellmates considered her a traitor. The idea was to induce a state of confusion and helplessness so extreme that it would shatter any notion of loyalty or resistance. Although there were no official psychiatric departments in Gestapo headquarters, some interrogators received additional training from the German Institute of Applied Psychology in Leipzig. There, they were instructed in body reading techniques, controlled stimulus deprivation, and language manipulation. This training sought to transform interrogation into a form of systematic mental aggression, beyond mere physical violence. Declassified documents from the Nuremberg Tribunal revealed that many of these practices were applied with particular intensity to women, as they were considered more vulnerable to emotional pressure. The combination of isolation, sensory manipulation, and attacks on their emotional ties was perceived as an efficient way to achieve results, without the need for visible exposure to brutal methods, thus making it difficult to later prove torture before international bodies. For women taken by the Gestapo, the invisible wounds of the psychological torture suffered during their captivity were often more terrible than the physical suffering. While bruises and broken bones can heal, the anguished memories and pain endured in the dark confines of Gestapo prisons lingered long after those who survived. To achieve this psychological torture, the Gestapo used sensory manipulation tactics to disorient the prisoners and weaken their will. To cause significant psychological distress, the captives were frequently subjected to loud, continuous noise. Loud music, repetitive screaming, or banging sounds were used to affect their ability to concentrate, sleep, or think clearly. This constant noise increased tension and anxiety, reducing mental stamina and making the prisoners more susceptible to interrogation. After forcing the captives to endure long periods of loud noise, the Gestapo would suddenly stop the noise. This transition from noise to silence left the prisoners confused, frightened, and exhausted, as they did not know what would happen next or when the silence would be broken. Many captured women were deceived into believing that by cooperating they could save their lives or protect their families, generating false hopes and forcing them to reveal information or confess. These promises, however, were frequently false, leaving the women devastated when they were not fulfilled. Furthermore, the women were frequently kept in solitary confinement for long periods, sometimes without natural light or sensory stimulation. This extreme isolation caused mental disorientation, leaving the prisoners feeling completely abandoned and powerless. Another method used was to employ undercover agents posing as fellow captives to gain their trust and gather the information the women shared in confidence. These strategies not only exploited the captives' trust, but also increased their feelings of betrayal and hopelessness, further weakening their mental health. The Gestapo also forced the women to stay awake for days, taking advantage of their sleep deprivation to extract more information. Guards used bright lights, loud noises, and unexpected movements to keep the prisoners awake, making it impossible for them to rest even for a few minutes. The lack of sleep caused significant fatigue, making it difficult to maintain mental strength. Over time, this fatigue resulted in disorientation, increased anxiety, and a weakened mental state, making the captives more likely to confess their secrets. Along with sleep deprivation, prisoners were kept hungry and thirsty by providing insufficient food and water, or by making them wait long periods before being allowed to eat or drink. The women were frequently given morsels of food that were not enough to sustain them, resulting in a constant state of hunger and weakness. The thirst and hunger wore them down physically, causing dizziness, fatigue, and a lack of vitality. The Gestapo also often carried out mock executions to instill fear in prisoners, making them believe they were about to die. Guards escorted prisoners through corridors toward execution sites or lined them up in front of a firing squad, accompanied by the sounds of guns being cocked and shouted orders. In some cases, they were led into what appeared to be an execution chamber or to a chair where they were blindfolded and told their time had come. This terrifying experience left the prisoners paralyzed with horror, not knowing whether they would live or die. Another harsh strategy used by the Gestapo was forcing female prisoners to witness the torture or punishment of other prisoners, including friends and family members. The women were occasionally forced to watch others being interrogated, beaten, or even executed. Witnessing these violent crimes was a harrowing experience for the captives, leaving them with enormous feelings of shame, helplessness, and despair. Seeing someone they knew and loved being mistreated or suffering frequently created in them a sense of responsibility or concern that they could have prevented it by collaborating, even if this wasn't true. This strategy was intended to reduce the prisoners' morale by making them realize that their resistance could cause someone else's suffering. While psychological strategies slowly weakened the prisoners' will, the physical environment where these techniques were carried out reinforced the mental collapse. The conditions of confinement were not just precarious, they were designed to continually aggravate the suffering. The cells, the corridors, the shared spaces, or their lack, were integral to the torture mechanism. A whip was unnecessary when the space itself was sufficient to induce despair. This was how the architecture of torment operated. Every corner of the Gestapo prisons was designed so that one could break without having to scream. Suffocating shadows, the harrowing reality of Gestapo prisons. During the height of the Nazi regime, the Gestapo operated a network of more than 1,500 detention facilities throughout occupied Europe. These included local jails, converted administrative buildings, transit centers, and special sections within regular police stations. In Germany, the main prisons used by the Gestapo were located in Berlin, Columbia House, Düsseldorf, Hamburg, Munich, Frankfurt, and Leipzig. As the occupation expanded, other facilities were established in Warsaw, Prague, Vienna, Brussels, Amsterdam, Oslo, and Paris. Many of these structures were adapted to maximize isolation, control, and torture capacity. The number of women detained varied widely by region. In Berlin, it is estimated that around 15% of prisoners were women, while in Prague and Krakow, the proportion exceeded 30% due to the high level of local resistance activity. The largest prisons could hold between 400 and 1,000 detainees, but overcrowding often doubled those numbers. In some transit centers, such as Malines in Belgium or Drancy in France, densities of up to one female prisoner for every 15 square meters of available space were recorded. The Gestapo's internal instructions, known as Dienstvorschriften, specified certain structural minimums for cells, but these were rarely met. In theory, a female cell was to have 2 square meters per person, access to a closed sanitary container, and 10 minutes of daily ventilation. In practice, these standards were frequently ignored, especially in eastern regions, where conditions were deliberately harsher. Later reports by Allied commissions revealed that women were confined in windowless basements, exposed to extreme temperatures and without access to underwear or hygiene products. The transport of female prisoners was managed by the Reichssicherheitshauptamt, RSHA, which coordinated with the railway departments to carry out transfers between cities, camps, and prisons. Transfer orders, called Überstellungsscheine, were processed bureaucratically and quickly. The women were transported in sealed, unventilated freight cars without access to bathrooms, food, or water. The journeys could last between 10 and 72 hours, depending on the destination, and were supervised by members of the SD or temporarily assigned military police. Upon arriving at their new destinations, the women were registered, stripped of their belongings, and distributed according to a classification system based on age, origin, and perceived political danger. This logistics allowed the Gestapo to move thousands of detainees across the continent, maintaining the opaqueness of their operations and hindering any attempt at rescue or appeal. The Gestapo tortured women captives in small, overcrowded prisons, both emotionally and physically. Their cells were often too small for the number of people crammed into them, with barely enough room to sit, let alone lie down. Conditions were stifling, with poor ventilation causing intense discomfort and at times dangerous levels of oxygen depletion, causing some prisoners to lose consciousness. The prisoners shared a small, filthy bucket as a toilet which would quickly overflow. This unsanitary environment facilitated the spread of disease, and many detainees fell ill as a result. The stench, coupled with the lack of fresh air, was unbearable, causing nausea and severe physical discomfort. Some survivors described the cells as so congested that prisoners had to sleep sitting up, pressed against one another. This not only prevented them from sleeping peacefully, but also intensified their feelings of helplessness and despair, as any sense of personal space or dignity was robbed. Due to the lack of space, they were forced to sleep in uncomfortable positions, sitting or standing for long periods without rest. This greatly impeded blood circulation, causing swollen extremities, painful cramps, and potentially long-term nerve damage. Dysentery, tuberculosis, and skin infections spread rapidly due to the lack of basic hygiene. The limited ventilation in these cells, combined with oppressive heat or extreme cold, depending on the season, increased the spread of respiratory illnesses, leaving many prisoners unable to stand or move. Psychologically, being confined was extremely stressful, compounded by feelings of claustrophobia and helplessness. Due to the chronic lack of personal space, hygiene, and hope, many detainees developed severe anxiety, depression, and even signs of trauma-induced psychosis. This claustrophobic torture left inmates physically weakened and mentally traumatized, robbing them of their will. Early in the history of the Gestapo, the authorities decided that, due to the large number of women detainees, it was necessary to create facilities specifically for female prisoners. The Lichtenberg concentration camp was converted for this purpose in 1937, becoming one of the first camps specifically for women until its closure in 1939, when all the women were transferred to Ravensbrück. There, they endured brutal treatment, inadequate food, and a complete lack of medical care. Most of the political prisoners were deported, but those deemed most dangerous by the Berlin government were incarcerated in poor accommodations, with insufficient hygienic conditions and a high level of psychological stress. Women, especially those from the Jewish community, endured overcrowded and unsanitary conditions in places such as Czernowitz in Romania, a city that today belongs to the territory of Ukraine. There are reports of women dying of exhaustion from the strain they endured in these prisons, most of which were located outside of Germany. The terrifying Czernowitz prison facilities were already in use long before the Nazi invasion of Romania and continued to operate during the Soviet occupation of the country. Persistent cruelty and broken spirits, the Gestapo's reign of terror in France and Norway. The Gestapo's operational structure in France was headed by Obersturmführer Helmut Knochen, who was appointed head of the Sicherheitsdienst, SD, and the Gestapo in Paris in 1940. Under his direct command operated a network of regional headquarters distributed in key cities such as Lyon, Bordeaux, Dijon, and Marseille. One of the most notorious commanders was Klaus Barbie, head of the Gestapo in Lyon, whose unit was responsible for hundreds of arrests, torture, and deportations to Auschwitz between 1942 and 1944. These officers worked closely with the Vichy police and the Milice Française, a French paramilitary organization that actively supported the Nazi regime. Coordination between the Gestapo and the Vichy government allowed for the implementation of an efficient network of repression. In 1943, the so-called Sonderaktion Night und Nebel, Night and Fog Action, was extended to French territory, authorizing the enforced disappearance of resistance fighters without trial. In that year alone, more than 7,000 people were arrested under this directive. According to the archives of the French Ministry of the Interior, between 1940 and 1944, at least 75,000 people were arrested by the Gestapo, of whom 40,000 were deported and around 10,000 were executed or died under torture. In Norway, the Nazi repression structure took shape after the occupation in April 1940. The Gestapo was headed by Siegfried Fehmer, an SS officer who settled in Oslo as head of the German security police. Fehmer operated under the command of Reichskommissar Josef Terboven, Hitler's direct representative in the country. The Norwegian Gestapo had divisions in Bergen, Trondheim, Kristiansand, and Tromsø, and maintained a tense but functional relationship with the collaborationist Norwegian police led by Jonas Lie, a former Minister of the Interior. The arrest system focused primarily on dissidents, members of the civil resistance movement, Hjemmefronten, and those suspected of aiding Jews. It is estimated that at least 3,000 Norwegian women were arrested by the Gestapo, and around 750 were deported to camps such as Ravensbrück or Sachsenhausen. Official statistics from the Norwegian Resistance Council put the number of recorded arrests at over 12,000, with approximately 3,500 people executed or dying in custody. In both France and Norway, the Gestapo was integrated into local structures through a mixed system of direct control and collaboration. In France, this cooperation was ideological. In Norway, it was more instrumental and coercive. In both countries, however, the Gestapo operated with operational autonomy, legal impunity, and logistical support from local authorities. Its operations combined bureaucratic efficiency, systematic brutality, and an obsession with total control of the civilian population. In France, the Gestapo caused enormous suffering from the start of the mass raids, murdering around 40,000 people on court orders. But what happened to those tormented in the dark interrogation rooms is frankly unbelievable. Men and women were subjected to unimaginable cruelties. Some had their toes smashed or amputated, while others had needles and splinters inserted under their fingernails. Victims were beaten and whipped until they were in a deplorable state. Electric shocks and immersion in ice-cold water to the point of near suffocation were common tortures. The Gestapo used even more inhumane methods to force women to talk. Knowing that women often cared about their beauty, they employed brutal methods to damage their appearance and break their spirits. They enjoyed disfiguring their appearance, and this torture could continue for days or even weeks. During interrogations, women's faces could be cut open or even parts of their ears or noses mutilated. Their hair was ripped out, their nails removed, or their appearance was completely ruined. The Gestapo believed a woman's legs were equally important to her body image, so they inflicted deep cuts and damaged bones, transforming their bodies into sources of pain. Along with the harsh physical torture, the living conditions in French detention centers were equally horrific. Women who had been tortured were crammed into tiny cells designed for 5 people, but sometimes as many as 20 were crammed into a single cell. This limited space increased the likelihood of contracting disease. The women were frequently denied access to fresh air by not being allowed outside. They were also forbidden from communicating with their families and kept in complete isolation. In Kristiansand, Norway, there was a building that became known as the Norwegian House of Horror. Unlike the Gestapo in France, which often employed horrendous torture methods, the Gestapo in Norway initially tried to avoid torturing women with chains, electric shocks, or extreme violence. Instead, they devised even more horrific methods to punish the women. For example, they disfigured their hands and crushed their joints, but the psychological torment was frequently worse. One particularly cruel method involved torturing a woman in front of her husband, mutilating him, or beating their children, who were also taken away for interrogation. Sometimes the executioners would switch roles, allowing the husband to watch as his wife was beaten or even sexually assaulted. The Gestapo also reportedly targeted teenage girls in the House of Horror directly in front of their devastated families. This shocking behavior had a great effect in Norway, especially since the country had almost never used the death penalty before World War II. After the war in 1947, all known executioners who tortured citizens were publicly hanged. The Norwegian government even amended the law for this purpose. This is perhaps the only case of mass executions for crimes in Norway in the last 2 or 3 centuries. Tortures in Ravensbrück and Yugoslavia. Ravensbrück camp are among the most detailed documentation of medical crimes of the Nazi regime. Between 1942 and 1945, at least 86 women were selected as subjects for non-consensual surgical tests. Internal SS records identify at least 3 experimental groups: wound infection treatments, bone regeneration trials, and pain and drug tolerance tests. The infections were deliberately induced by introducing bacteria such as Streptococcus pyogenes, Clostridium perfringens, or Staphylococcus aureus in open wounds, accompanied by dirt, wood splinters, or glass fragments. The official purpose was to simulate combat injuries and evaluate the effectiveness of sulfonamides, but in practice the result was the death of at least 30 prisoners from gangrene, septicemia, or failed amputations. The physicians involved in these experiments included Dr. Karl Gebhardt, chief surgeon of the SS, and Himmler's personal physician, Dr. Fritz Fischer, and Dr. Herta Oberhäuser, the only team members tried at the Nuremberg trials. Surgical procedures were meticulously documented, including photographic monitoring of the progression of infections. Some women underwent surgery up to 4 times, leaving bones exposed or muscles partially removed. After the war, photographs of these procedures served as direct evidence of medical war crimes. In addition to the experiments, Ravensbrück housed a systematic policy of medical selection. Inmates deemed useless were subjected to covert euthanasia or sent to other facilities for elimination. In 1945, with the construction of a gas chamber within the camp, executions intensified. It is estimated that more than 50,000 women died at Ravensbrück due to direct murder, experiments, starvation, and disease. In the case of Yugoslavia, the Nazi occupation began in April 1941. In the following years, prisons and detention centers operated by the Gestapo were established in cities such as Belgrade, Novi Sad, Nice, and Zagreb. One of the best known was the Sajmišta camp near Belgrade, where thousands of Serbian, Jewish, and partisan women were held. Key dates include the cleansing operation of November 1941, during which the Gestapo organized mass raids in the Drina and Sava regions. Declassified files from the Yugoslav War Crimes Commission document that at least 12 centers were used for intensive interrogations, including the George Washington Street facility in Belgrade. Practices included physical torture, sensory deprivation, and sexual violence. These facilities were also used by the Sicherheitsdienst, SD, in direct collaboration with local officials and the German military administration. Deportation routes connected these prisons with camps such as Jasenovac and Auschwitz. Ravensbrück was a Nazi concentration camp located in northern Germany, founded in 1939. Ravensbrück was specifically designed to imprison and exploit women through forced labor. During its operation, it held around 130,000 women and children captive, most of whom were subjected to horrific conditions and extreme cruelty. The camp became known for the cruel medical experiments performed on the prisoners, frequently overseen by SS doctors, such as Dr. Karl Gebhardt. These experiments included intentionally infecting wounds with germs to study the progression of infections, which caused tremendous pain and, in many cases, disfigurement or death. One type of experiment involved infecting wounds with bacteria, dirt, glass, or other foreign objects to simulate war injuries. The goal was to investigate the effectiveness of sulfur drugs, an early form of antibiotic therapy, in treating infections. However, this frequently resulted in severe infections, gangrene, and death. Survivors were left with disfiguring scars, constant pain, and permanent disabilities. Furthermore, surgeons performed procedures that altered or removed bones and muscles, leaving many survivors permanently disabled. Some prisoners underwent amputations to test healing treatments or simply for experimentation, resulting in high mortality rates and indescribable pain. Women at Ravensbrück were subjected to forced labor, working long hours in quarries, construction projects, and later in armaments and military supply factories. The work was frequently dangerous and grueling, with insufficient clothing, food, and rest, causing extreme hunger, illness, and exhaustion. The lack of medical care and unsanitary conditions led to disease outbreaks, contributing to the camp's high mortality rate. As the camp's population grew and conditions worsened, the SS built a gas chamber in early 1945. Thousands of prisoners were murdered there, especially as the Nazi regime intensified its extermination efforts toward the end of the war. Others died of malnutrition, disease, or exhaustion, or were shot. Many prisoners who were too weak to work or fell ill were frequently singled out for elimination. The Gestapo operated with a brutal and terrifying mentality in its facilities, often attempting to hide its torture tactics in relatively peaceful European countries. But in Yugoslavia, the Baltic states, and Poland, they abandoned all pretense of decency. In Riga prisons, women were subjected to crimes such as beatings, stripping, and forced dancing. The situation in Poland was no less dire. One of the most horrific tactics was using a communal bathroom, which prisoners considered the worst place of torture. The extent to which the Gestapo went with its crimes against humanity is still unknown, although practices such as imitation drowning, which left many former prisoners disturbed, are mentioned. Evidence shows that countless women could no longer bear the abuse and went mad. A particularly cruel torture technique was known as cold torture. During cold weather, prisoners were led into a shower chamber and drenched with water. At first, the women thought they were being allowed to wash the dirt, blood, and insects off their skin. But the showers never stopped, and the drains barely worked. The women quickly realized something was terribly wrong. Despite their desperate screams and pleas, no one opened the shower doors. They ended up standing in freezing water, almost submerged in ice, while the sun shone outside, making the situation even more unbearable. One prisoner even warned that such torture would not go unpunished, implying that those who survived would face serious illnesses. One of the most horrific forms of torture carried out by the Gestapo was the attack on the dignity of young, attractive women. Many were sexually assaulted before being taken to their cells. Sometimes women were forced to strip naked in these cages before being taken to the corridor, where German officers waited in line, shouting obscene insults and laughing mockingly. Pregnant women were particularly terrified by this situation. In this strange environment, the Gestapo unleashed a nightmare of brutality, frequently beating and kicking these women, even during interrogations. In some cases, women were forced to give birth in such harsh conditions. During the Nazi occupation of Czechoslovakia, women captured by the Gestapo were also subjected to a variety of abuses. Many women were arrested for their role in the resistance or as relatives of resistance fighters. In prison, the women had to endure overcrowded and unsanitary conditions, often crammed into small cells with little access to food and basic hygiene. Interrogation sessions were especially cruel, with the women subjected to severe physical abuse, including beatings, kicking, and electric shocks. The Gestapo sought to extract confessions or information and frequently used sexual abuse as a form of torture. Many women were victims of sexual assault and abuse, which not only humiliated them but also instilled fear in their families and communities. On occasion, the Gestapo took the women from their cells for interrogation, often in front of others, worsening their shame and anxiety. Courage in the Darkness captured women's stories of resistance against Gestapo brutality. Following World War II, various Allied governments and organizations officially recognized hundreds of women for their roles in the resistance against the Nazi regime, including many who survived Gestapo torture. In France, more than 1,000 women received the Croix de Guerre for acts of bravery in the face of the enemy, while another 750 were awarded the Médaille de la Résistance. A few, such as Geneviève de Gaulle, Antonioz, Charles de Gaulle's niece, and a Ravensbrück survivor, were awarded the Grand Cross of the Legion of Honor, France's highest civilian honor. In Poland, institutions such as the Institute of National Remembrance documented more than 2,000 cases of women detained and tortured by the Gestapo for their affiliation with underground movements, awarding many posthumous decorations. At the institutional level, numerous memorials have been erected in honor of women persecuted and abused by the Gestapo. In Berlin, the Memorial to Women in the German Resistance, inaugurated in 1995, includes a section dedicated to those arrested, interrogated, or executed on the direct orders of the Nazi secret police. In France, the city of Lyon, home to Klaus Barbie's feared leadership, houses the Centre d'Histoire de la Résistance et de la Déportation, which preserves archives, artifacts, and actual files related to women captured by the Gestapo. In Norway, the Oslo Holocaust Museum displays records of women detained in the so-called House of Horror in Kristiansand, including documents from post-war trials of their torturers. Regarding formal records, the Shoah Commemoration Commission estimates that more than 20,000 women in Europe were arrested by the Gestapo on charges of resistance, collaboration with Jews, or anti-Nazi propaganda. Many of these women faced extreme violence, but some managed to survive and later testify before military tribunals or national restitution commissions. Their files have been classified, digitized, and preserved by organizations such as Yad Vashem in Israel, the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, and the German National Archives. In addition to individual recognitions, countries such as France, Poland, the Czech Republic, and the Netherlands have instituted commemorative dates specifically dedicated to women persecuted by the Third Reich. These official events seek not only to honor their memory, but also to historically accurately document the role they played and the price many paid for resisting Nazi terror. Incredibly, some women managed to endure these horrific conditions and survive. For example, intelligence officer Odette Hallows was imprisoned in the Gestapo dungeons, where her fingernails were pulled out and a hot iron was applied to her back. Szabo, a French resistance fighter, also suffered unimaginable pain. According to witnesses, Szabo had aged decades by the time she and a group of prisoners were led to the firing squad. Facing the firing squad, she was unrecognizable. Violette made an impression on her executioners because she was the only sentenced woman to face her fate head-on. The others were too frightened to turn around and were shot from behind. British intelligence officer Eileen Neern miraculously survived the torture cells. Later, she was able to recount her experience and recalled being tortured in a bathroom, where she was nearly drowned in a tub of water. Irina Sendler, who died in 2008 at the age of 98, was another courageous member of an underground group called Żegota, which helped rescue Jews during the difficult days of World War II in German-occupied Poland. In the fall of 1943, Irena became the head of Żegota's children's section. However, she was captured by the Gestapo just days later. She was violently beaten and tortured, but never revealed any information about the children or her fellow rescuers. She was eventually released from Gestapo custody thanks to a bribe paid by her co-workers. Despite her release, she continued to work with Żegota under a new name. Simone Lagrange and her family were arrested in 1944 by the Gestapo. They were then taken to Klaus Barbie, the Gestapo chief in Lyon, who was famous for his cruel interrogation techniques. Barbie subjected Simone, who was only 13 years old, to horrendous torture. He attempted to destroy her spirit with both physical and psychological violence, subjecting her to constant beatings, attempted drowning, and the suffering of hanging from pronged handcuffs. Despite the inconceivable pain, Simone refused to tell him anything about her family's resistance activities, even after watching Barbie execute her father in front of her. Eventually, Simone was sent to the Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration camp, where the horrors continued. She endured forced labor, malnutrition, and the constant threat of death. Nonetheless, even at Auschwitz, she remained strong. Simone miraculously managed to survive until the camp's liberation in 1945, although she was left physically and mentally traumatized. Years later, Simone testified against Barbie in court, helping to bring justice for her and the countless others who suffered during his reign. Her testimony was key to convicting him of crimes against humanity. Barbie was described as a monster, and Simone spoke about the strength it took to overcome the horrific memories that haunted her. The story of Lise Lesèvre is another horrific testament to the brutality of Klaus Barbie and the Gestapo in Nazi-occupied France. Lise was a member of the French resistance during World War II, fighting against the Nazi regime that had occupied her country. Lesèvre was captured by the Gestapo in 1944 and brought before Klaus Barbie. He subjected her to constant torture for 9 straight days. Barbie used physical and psychological techniques to extract information from her. Lesèvre later stated that she was severely beaten and lost consciousness several times. Barbie tortured her in various ways, including hanging her by her wrists, brutally beating her, and beating her back so hard that her spine suffered irreparable damage. Lesèvre's fortitude and resilience were impressive. She endured the torture without revealing information about her fellow resistance fighters. When World War II ended in 1945, the Gestapo, like other Nazi organizations, was dissolved by the Allied forces, and many of its members received various punishments. During the Nuremberg trials in 1945 and 1946, the International Military Tribunal convicted prominent Nazi officials and organizations, declaring the Gestapo a criminal organization for its actions. Beyond the main Nuremberg trials, the Allies conducted other trials, such as the Nuremberg aftermath trials that targeted the Gestapo, and many low-ranking members were prosecuted in Allied and German courts in the following years. High-profile figures, such as Adolf Eichmann and Klaus Barbie, managed to escape for years until they were captured and brought to trial decades later. West Germany, and later unified Germany, continued to prosecute former Gestapo members in the years following the war, with increasing interest in the 1960s and 1970s, leading to new trials as surviving individuals were discovered and charged. The harrowing testimonies of women tortured by the Gestapo during World War II demonstrate the depth of human brutality and the lengths to which people will go in their quest for power and control. These tortures, ranging from extreme physical pain to psychological manipulation, reflect the tragedy that gripped so many people during that era. Despite the darkness, the perseverance and courage of individuals like Irina Sendler and Simone Lagrange stands out, demonstrating the immense strength of the human spirit. As we reflect on this tragic past, we must commit to ensuring that such horrors are never repeated, building a world where dignity and humanity prevail over brutality.